It was the most decisive 37 weeks in American history, forever changing who we are as a nation and redefining freedom.
What happened in Georgia in 1864 did determine whether or not there was going to be a United States.
And the one figure who affected that outcome more than any other is also its most controversial.
He's like the most probably polarizing guy.
One of the most fascinating figures in a war that had a lot of fascinating people in it.
They kicked him out of the army for a while because they thought he was insane.
Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, the man who vows to make Georgia howl.
Sherman came down and gave you guys what for?
He got fucking lucky. Pull up a picture of Sherman, huh, Mr. Sherman, the Civil War?
He was the man.
We grew up hating Sherman. We despised Sherman for what he did to us.
Sherman didn't bring on the war, as far as he's concerned. He decided to disregard the Constitution. Now you're paying the consequences of it. And don't blame me for that. Don't blame me for that. It's not my fault. I'm here. I didn't start this, but by God, I'm going to end it.
What Sherman was contemplating doing had never really been done before.
It's the terror. Sherman's waging war against the minds of his opponents.
I do so hope the war will be over this year. God grant that we may all be spared to spend a happy life together.
I could make the march and make Georgia howl.
I'm in danger!
It is the spring of 1864. The American Civil War is entering its fourth year. 500,000 Americans are dead, yet there is no end in sight. In the North, President Abraham Lincoln is facing re-election. His prospects are dim.
I mean, anytime you have a war like that where they've been fighting for 3 years, it starts to become unpopular at a certain point. They'd been drafting people and everything like that, and Lincoln wasn't the most popular at the moment.
Lincoln remarks, "I'm going to be beaten, and unless some change takes place, badly beaten."
Basically said, like, we're not going to win the election in November, but whoever's still left needs to promise to carry on the fight.
Lincoln must show that Union armies can win the war. He needs a victory. This is the situation in April of 1864, as Sherman prepares to invade Georgia.
Since they've been doing so much to destroy us, we have to destroy them. William T. Sherman.
His dad died when he was 9, and he got sent to live with a family friend.
Sherman's new foster father was Thomas Ewing.
He was later a senator and secretary of the Treasury, so a pretty high up there type of character. 1840, he graduated from West Point. He was 6th in his class. So one thing that's kind of interesting about that is a lot of those guys, they would fight against like former classmates, you know, because they all graduated from West Point.
Right.
At some point in time. So they all kind of knew each other and knew their ticks. If they were a passive guy or an aggressive guy, or the people who really, really study the characters and the personalities of the war. That's just one thing that makes it a little bit different. The Mexican-American War was prior to the Civil War, obviously, and it was kind of one of those things where America was kind of fighting for land. A lot of the Civil War generals saw time, or the bigger names in the Civil War would see time in the Mexican-American War. That was kind of like their proving ground. Not Sherman, he was stationed out in California. He didn't really see any action. He was there right around the discovery of gold, and kind of partly why people moved west for that in 49. So 1853, he retired from the Army and began working as a banker out there.
Bored with the peacetime Army, Sherman resigned in 1853 to try his hand at business and banking in San Francisco.
And then 1857 hits, and there was a panic or something. The whole bank collapsed. So he had some of his friends had money invested with him in his bank. And Sherman, he ended up actually liquidating $20,000 of his own money to help cover the losses of his clients.
After failing there, he took a job as superintendent of a military academy in Louisiana, what would become Louisiana State University.
Louisiana secedes from the Union. This is January of 1861. So he's in Louisiana working at that university. He pens a letter to another professor at the university at the time, and it's pretty prophetic. You people of the South don't know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. It is all folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You people speak so lightly of war, you don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. You mistake, too, the people of the North. They are a peaceable people, but an earnest people, and they will fight, too. They're not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or pair of shoes can you make. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined people on earth right at your doors. You are bound to fail. Only in your spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else you are totally unprepared, with a bad cause to start with. At first you will make headway, but as your limited resources begin to fail, shut out from the markets of Europe as you will be, your cause will begin to wane. If your people will but stop and think, they must see in the end that you will surely fail.
Wow.
So
Nailed it.
I mean, yeah, he could have wrote that after the war. I mean, it's basically exactly what happened. So Lincoln was the president, so he got elected. That's kind of what kicked off the secession fever. And he was in a little bit of a predicament because he didn't just want to go invade the South. Not that it would have been unprovoked, but there wasn't no fighting or anything had happened, so if he just invades, it's a little bit different. But so he almost kind of baited him into firing on Fort Sumter, kind of what kicked off the fighting. Lincoln at this point in time calls for 75,000 men to enlist for 3 months to go help put down the rebellion, which in hindsight is pretty laughable.
When the war breaks out in 1861, Sherman rejoins the U.S. Army. Within a year, he suffers a nervous breakdown.
Like I said, he did not want to be the head man in charge, and he even told Lincoln, he said, quote, he had a quote, extreme desire to serve in a subordinate capacity and in no event to be left in a superior command, end quote. So then Anderson steps aside. He's in control all of a sudden.
Sherman at the beginning of the war was a total wreck. He was stationed in Kentucky, and he had a nervous breakdown.
He never thought he had the right amount of men and supplies, and he was vastly overestimating the enemy numbers.
He imagined hundreds of thousands of Confederate soldiers coming up to attack him.
And Kentucky's a border state at this time, so they're a slave state, but they're in the Union. At that point in time, they didn't know, is Kentucky, are they going to secede?
I see.
Some of those border states that were slave states, they were almost kind of feeling out, and they had, obviously there was some Confederate sentiment. So he was kind of thinking, like, all these people in the countryside are against me, and the Union or the Confederates have all this manpower and everything like that. And he tells Lincoln that he needs 200,000 men to hold Kentucky. And if you remember, just a couple months ago, Lincoln was at first asking for 75,000 men for to put down the entire rebellion. So Lincoln sends out his Secretary of War, Simon Cameron is his name, to inspect the situation out and just see if what Sherman is saying is right. And he doubles down. He says, look around, we need 200,000 men. With Cameron is Samuel Wilkerson of the New York Tribune, who would be the guy who would later write the article declaring Sherman insane. Cameron asked all the other generals in Kentucky for their assessment, and they did not align with Sherman at all. So, then it only got worse. He was was described as making the quote quick, sharp, odd gestures, end quote, and he'd just be pacing back and forth and chain smoking cigars, and just he wouldn't eat, didn't sleep. He's up all night. I mean, just kind of going berserk a little bit. In hindsight, they didn't know. I think they would call it like melancholic. Oh, he's going through a patch of melancholy. If you ever read these old writings, that'd be how they would describe what we would call it today, like any sort of like depression or whatever like that. But looking back, people think that he probably had some bipolar, which is like manic. You know, I'm not a psychiatrist or whatever, but from what I understand, it's like people will be manic and then they'll be depressive. And he was going through the manic phase of like can't sleep. He's all real jittery and pacing, you know, and then there's a depressive side of it where you just don't want to do anything. So looking back, that's kind of what they think it probably was. He described to his wife that, you know, like he said, he was up all night, he couldn't eat or anything like that. He said, I find myself riding a whirlwind, unable to guide the storm. He anticipated failure and humiliation, which, quote, nearly makes me crazy. Indeed, I may be so now, end quote. Someone finally gets his wife to come see what's going on, and she said, yeah, I've seen this before. He kind of did this out in California a couple of times. So on November 8th, he gets relieved of command and sent to a lesser command in St. Louis, and where he's not in charge or anything like that. But it only progressed on, and finally they took him from St. Louis on December 1st. He went home for 3 weeks, and his wife, I guess, nursed him back to health. Like in those days, they would just read him their favorite books, give them their favorite foods and everything like that.
After several weeks' rest at home in Ohio, and with the support of his wife Ellen and his friend Ulysses S. Grant, Sherman soon recovered.
They say in bipolar disorder, the average mood swing like that goes into remission by itself eventually. So you never know exactly how much that would have happened if he never would have left. But anyway, so he goes home for 3 weeks to Ohio and gets kind of back to the way he was before. He goes back to St. Louis on December 19th. And at this point in time, he's under the command of Henry Halleck, who took a liking to him. And he sends him to Cairo, Illinois, to serve as the logistical coordinator under Grant's army. This is the first time he met Grant and developed a friendship. He would later go on, he talked about Grant. Grant was accused of being kind of a drunkard. I don't know if you'd heard that at all. Yeah. So he said, Grant stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk, and now we stand by each other. Grant brings him to Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, and puts him in charge of a division, and this is in March of 1862. So this is kind of leading up to the Battle of Shiloh, or Shiloh Hill. Sherman's biographer, Robert O'Connell, called Shiloh, quote, the turning point of his life, because this would have been like the first real battle after his insane streak, or whatever you want to call it, back in Kentucky. So this kind of proved to him, like, oh, well, you know, maybe I can do this. So there's a large rebel army that's 20 miles south of the U.S. Army in Corinth, Mississippi. And the Federal Army, the U.S. Army, they're just kind of drilling their men, and they're not digging trenches or trying to strengthen their position or anything like that. They're just drilling. Where they're at, they had their flanks were protected by water, and they kind of took for granted the fact that the Confederates weren't going to attack them. But when he was going crazy in Kentucky, he was constantly thinking like, oh, he was pretty, what's the word? Paranoid, I guess. Yeah, pretty paranoid that they were going to be attacked and everything like that. Well, now they just don't have the slightest concern of it. So on April 4th, a lieutenant and 6 men were captured by Confederate cavalry, and some Union cavalry went out in search of them. And a guy by the name of Major Elbridge Ricker came back to report that he had seen the Confederate line of battle with artillery and everything just 2 miles from. And artillery is like they wheel those big field cannons out, so it's not like they're just seeing men out. Because they'd have cavalry would be the guys on the horses that would go out in front of the infantry is like the foot soldiers, and the cavalry would go around, and a lot of what they did was scout positions and things like that. So when they see the artillery, it's like you got to wheel. If the Southern forces are in Corinth, Mississippi, you got to wheel the cannons and everything 20 miles. So it's not like they're just on some sort of scouting expedition. If you see that, you know that the whole army's probably moving and something's about to go down. So anyways, Ricker reports that he sees the line of battle 2 miles from where Sherman was, and he had with him 10 Confederate prisoners and a saddle of some rebel cavalry colonel they'd killed to help illustrate his point. Sherman tells him, quote, "You militia officers get scared too easy," end quote. So now he's like the complete opposite of what he was, just has no fear, caution, or anything at all. They still are not digging trenches or anything like that. They're just drilling basically still. I mean, just kind of like what they would be doing if, you know, they weren't about to prepare for battle or anything like that. So that same morning, a couple Union, just Army guys, saw across the field what they described as, quote, "the enemy in force, and to all appearances they were getting breakfast. We saw infantry, cavalry, and artillery very plainly." So the captain, he sends one of his sergeants to tell Sherman, who is so annoyed he arrested the man, actually, for what he thought was crying wolf. The next day, Colonel Jesse Appler sent Sherman a report of Confederate infantry in the woods right in front of Sherman. And Sherman tells him, quote, "Take your damned regiment back to Ohio. There's no enemy nearer than Corinth." So Grant, at this time, he was kind of the head of what was going on down there, and Sherman's superior. He had gotten a little bit of word of this, and he messages Sherman like, "Hey, what's going on? We got all these reports of Confederates being right in front of you." And Sherman says, quote, "I have no doubt that nothing will occur today other than some picket firing. The enemy is saucy, but will not press our pickets far. I do not apprehend anything like an attack on our position." So one thing to keep in mind, Sherman, he's like at the southernmost point of where the federal troops are, and he also has probably like the greenest. I mean, they haven't really seen much fighting, which is probably, if any, which is probably not the best strategy to have. But so April 6th, the fighting breaks out, which is exactly what they were attacked on their position, exactly what Sherman thought wouldn't happen. Sherman, he says, quote, "I became satisfied for the first time that the enemy designed a determined attack on our whole camp. Our infantry and artillery opened along the whole line, and the battle became general," end quote, which is probably the understatement of the war. So that starts the fighting at Shiloh Hill, or Battle of Shiloh. 2-day fight. The Confederates kind of push forward on day one, and Grant gets some reinforcements and pushes them back on day 2. So it's a Union victory. The casualties of that battle were estimated at 23,746, which is, according to some stats, more than were lost in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and the Mexican-American War combined. But yeah, Sherman, I guess he fought hard and well, and got wounded twice, and actually had three horses shot from under him. Grant was happy with him and promoted him to Major General of Volunteers. Interesting that he got promoted even though it seemed like he was denying all these report. Like he could have been more prepared, but I guess he did a good job fighting. So after the battle, Grant, this is the one where Grant was accused of, because basically they were caught unprepared. I mean, like I was telling you, Sherman was denying all these reports. They were just not prepared for a battle at all, and people accused Grant of being drunk. So even though they won, because they got kind of demolished on the first day, and if it wasn't for Buell was the guy who brought in all his reinforcements, things might have been different, but they drove him back on the second day. But he took some heat because they were so unprepared, and Grant was thinking about resigning. And Sherman tells Grant, he said, the quote goes, "Before the Battle of Shiloh, I was cast down by a mere newspaper assertion of crazy. But that single battle gave me new life, and I'm now in high feather." And he told Grant that if he stayed, quote, "some happy accident might restore you to favor in your true place." Pretty prophetic. So now they've driven them back from where they were, which they're in like the very southern part of Tennessee. So after Shiloh, there's a couple other little battles, but eventually the Union or the Federal forces take Corinth, which is where the Confederates were prior to Shiloh, so 20 miles south, but it's in Mississippi. And now they're holding Corinth. They set their eyes on Vicksburg, which is an important city because it's on the Mississippi River, and the if the U.S. would control Vicksburg, it kind of gives them control of the whole river at that point. Basically cuts the Confederacy in half. So then you have the eastern half, and then they can no longer funnel supplies through Vicksburg. So it gives them control of the river. So it's a pretty important big city. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, called it the nailhead that holds the South's two halves together. And Lincoln, Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until that key is in our pocket, end quote. So both of these, the North and the South, they both understood the importance of that city. So, like I said, they're going to set their eyes on Vicksburg. They kind of tried to attack it once. It didn't really work out. So Grant gets the idea that he's going to separate from his supply line and have his men go live off the land. And then, so they try a couple attacks, don't really work. They end up just laying siege to the city, and they have it under siege for 47 days, which is crazy. But that's basically, they just try to almost starve them out. I mean, just throw a couple bombs in and everything like that. So on July 4th, the Confederates surrender, and this would be 1863. So they have this they win Vicksburg after the long round of fighting and then sieging ultimately. Around the same time, he sets Gettysburg is July, better check it, but I'm pretty sure it's July 1 through 3. Yeah, July 1 through 3. So while all that's happening out west, like the federal forces do pretty good out west. They really don't hardly lose many battles during the whole war there. But on the Eastern Front, it's different. So they really hadn't won a battle east, like Virginia and everything. That's where Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and all these guys are fighting. And so they invade. This is their second attempt to invade the North from the South. So they invaded, and then they fought Antietam, which was the bloodiest single day in American history. 132,000 forces engaged, and 22,717 casualties in one day.
One day, wow.
Which was a tie. So they had one, or they call it a draw. They had one draw, but basically Lee had been winning all these. But anyway, so they had previously tried, this is in 1862, to invade the North. They fight at Antietam. Lee kind of retreats. Basically, they called it a draw. The Union didn't try to follow him or anything like that. So then they had won at Chancellorsville, the South had, with Lee, and Stonewall Jackson died. But anyways, they invade the North again for a second time, and they get up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and they fight that battle, and the Union, they finally win a battle on the East, and that's, like I said, July 1 through 3. So then on the 4th, Vicksburg surrenders. So things are finally kind of going good for the Union on both fronts. Lincoln writes to Halleck, "We have certain information that Vicksburg surrendered to General Grant on the 4th of July. Now if General Meade can complete his work so gloriously prosecuted thus far by the literal or substantial destruction of Lee's army, the rebellion will be over. Yours truly, A. Lincoln." So they had driven Lee back from Gettysburg, and at this point in time, if Meade follows him, this is as vulnerable as Lee has been. Meade he's the commander of the Union forces at Gettysburg. So this is as vulnerable as Lee's been. And Lincoln's thinking, if we can take care of Lee's army here, the war will basically be over. And Meade doesn't do it. He lets Lee gets across the Potomac back into Virginia, and Lincoln wrote a letter to Meade, which would be pretty famous because he never sent it, but he just, even though, Gettysburg's kind of portrayed as this huge, great battle and everything, and the turning point of the war is what people will sometimes call it, because they really had, like I said, they hadn't won, then they finally win, and then they started to win after, but Lincoln didn't. He thought it was a great opportunity missed. So he says, quote, to Meade in a letter he never sent, quote, "My dear General, I do not believe you appreciate the magnitude of the misfortune involved in Lee's escape. He was within your easy grasp, and to have closed upon him would, in connection with our other late successes, have ended the war, end quote. So he thought it was really almost done, but it doesn't matter. Lee gets over into Virginia and the war drags on. We'll move ahead to November of 1863. The Army of the Cumberland, which is a Union army, is in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And Braxton Bragg, the Confederate general, and his men begin laying siege to the city, trying to starve them out, basically. Grant was given control of the Western forces at this time, and Sherman ended up taking Grant's old job as the head of the Army of the Tennessee. So Bragg had just won a battle, and he drove the U.S. forces into Chattanooga, Tennessee, and cut their supply line. So they're being sieged in Chattanooga. Rosecrans was the guy's name. He was the head of the Army of the Cumberland. He was planning to retreat out of Chattanooga, basically, and when Grant took the role as the head of the Western forces, he immediately replaced him with a guy by the name of George Thomas. He tells Thomas to basically hold the line. Yeah, they fought for 3 days and ended up broken free from the siege and drove the Confederates back, being an important victory. Like Chattanooga was a kind of important little area, laying the groundwork for Sherman's march to Atlanta and to the sea and everything like that later. 1864, Lincoln gives Grant control of all the Union forces, and Grant gives Sherman control of all the Western forces. So at this point in time in the war, the Confederates had they'd shifted their mindset of, we're no longer going to try to win by invading the North or anything like that. We're going to win the war by not losing. So, because in 1864, in the fall, in November, there would have been an election. Lincoln was, anytime you have a war like that for, they've been fighting for 3 years, it starts to become unpopular at a certain point. They'd been drafting people and everything like that, and Lincoln wasn't the most popular at the moment. He would actually end up signing he wrote a blind memorandum to his cabinet or whatever, and basically said, we're not going to win the election in November, but whoever's still left needs to promise to carry on the fight. The Confederates are not, like I said, they're not really trying to win. They're just trying to drag it out as long as they can and make it seem like this war is going to really, really take a long time and maybe it's not worth all the trouble.
Lincoln's re-election and the prospects for union and emancipation are very much in doubt. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the Democrats nominate former General George McClellan on a platform calling for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy.
George McClellan, he was in charge of the Army of the Potomac early in the war. He was a guy who Lincoln always kind of butted heads with because he never would. He famously always thought that the Confederates had twice the men they had, and he never would attack or do anything like that. So he's going to end up actually running as the Democratic nominee in 1864. So a lot of it is hinging around this election in November at this point in time. So yeah, this is the spring of 1864 now, when Lincoln hands over the army to Grant, and Grant hands over the Western Army to Sherman. There's two cities that are pretty important. Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy in Virginia, and that's where Robert E. Lee is kind of trying to hold it, and Grant's fighting there to try to take Richmond. And in the western side, there's Atlanta, which is the second biggest city, and that's where Joseph Johnston is the guy's name, the general of the Confederates who's trying to keep Sherman now from getting to Atlanta. But Sherman outnumbers Johnson 2-1, basically.
By May 25th, barely 2 weeks into the campaign, Johnson has been repeatedly outflanked and has retreated some 50 miles across 2 major rivers. He begs for reinforcements, but there are none to be had.
So early May 1864, they start skirmishing. This is in North Georgia, and by late July, Sherman has them pushed back to within 5 miles of Atlanta.
President Jefferson Davis is afraid that Johnston will give up the city without a fight. Davis believes the Confederacy must hold Atlanta at all cost. He has to make an agonizing decision. On July 17th, Davis relieves Johnston of command.
Jefferson Davis fired Johnston and replaced him with John Bell Hood, who was Johnston was a pretty, I guess, conservative, or however you would describe. He wasn't really going to go try to push the envelope and attack Sherman. He just kind of kept retreating and retreating and retreating. But Hood was like, yeah, well, I'll try to attack him, but he's got one guy for every two that Sherman has, so it didn't work out all that good for him. He tried attacking him a couple times, and
Hood knows that Sherman can't attack Atlanta's massive fortifications head-on. Instead, Sherman's goal is to cut the 4 railroads that keep the city supplied. Hood has to keep at least one railroad open if he is to have any chance of saving Atlanta.
Sherman ends up bombing the city and cutting all the train tracks into Atlanta, just trying to destroy it, and keep, if he can cut the tracks, then the rebels can't get the food and supplies and everything they need.
Sherman knows that the 12-mile ring of fortifications surrounding Atlanta is too strong to penetrate. Frustrated, he tries another tactic, unleashing a barrage of fire that no other American city has ever endured.
Sherman wanted to do a number on Atlanta, and we wanted to destroy Atlanta and make it a desolation. He would tell his artillery commanders, fire 50 rounds, all guns that can reach downtown.
So August 31st, they end up tearing the last railroad line, and Hood had to evacuate, and then Sherman captures Atlanta on September 2nd.
He hits the railroad above Jonesboro, cuts the last railroad supply line into Atlanta, and essentially at that point, the jig is up for Hood, and by extension, the jig is up for Atlanta.
Him capturing Atlanta was like huge for Lincoln, because then you finally have like a military success to point to, like, hey, we have Atlanta. The only thing we're missing is Richmond, and Sherman takes Atlanta. So now, like I said, Lincoln, they have some military success to point to, like things are coming close to an end. Let's just see this thing through.
The news electrifies the North. Lincoln's political fortunes soar with renewed hope for his re-election. It is one of the greatest turning points in American history.
They credit Sherman with doing as much as, well, maybe not as much as Lincoln, but being probably the second most important guy in the re-election. But yeah, him capturing Atlanta, that put a damper on McClellan's run for president, and of course Lincoln ends up getting reelected. So now he's in Atlanta, and he has this decision of like what to do from here, basically. And it's still kind of the odd time between September 2 and the election. Lincoln doesn't want him to do anything crazy like before the election. Basically, he's like just kind of tread water, and they wanted him to move back into Alabama. And Sherman was like, well, that doesn't really do any good. We've already kind of won what we need to there. Hood moves up into Tennessee and is trying to draw Sherman back up north to fight over land they'd already kind of fought over and everything like that. So Sherman he's like, well, he finally convinces Grant to let him, what he wants to do is he wants to march and take Savannah, or march to the sea, basically.
Now Sherman comes up with a new plan to crush Confederate resistance, once and for all.
Lincoln's like, oh, it's too risky, you can't march, and they'd have to cut their supply lines, everything like that. Lincoln says, not a good idea. And he finally convinces Grant that he's going to, to let him march. Grant says, okay. But he did have to wait till after the election. But Grant later said Sherman was the only guy he would let even attempt that. Like I said, Hood tried to kind of lure him back up north. Sherman splits his men. He sends some up north to kind of deal with Hood, and then he takes the rest, which is like roughly 60,000 men with him.
And he sends the rest of the army to Savannah, where it can be resupplied by sea, and then march north to Virginia to finish off Lee.
By this, I propose to demonstrate the vulnerability of the South that make its inhabitants feel that war and individual ruin are synonymous. I will push into the heart of Georgia, destroying all. I can make the march and make Georgia howl.
He leaves Atlanta. He leaves it pretty much in shambles. Like I said, they'd been bombing it and cutting the train tracks and everything like that.
He has to destroy anything that can be used by the Confederate Army to continue to wage war, to resist the United States.
They knocked down public buildings with battering rams, including the gas works and factories. Fearing that fire might get out of control, Sherman instructs his men not to burn any buildings until the last minute. In all, about 40% of Atlanta is destroyed. But Sherman is not finished.
He leaves Atlanta, sets out on the march. Like I said, no supply line. He'd been studying the census of 1860, trying to determine what route can I take where there's going to be enough crops and things that we don't have to have a supply line and we can live off of the land or live, just kind of forage and everything like that. And so he has a route that he's certain he can do that. He's trying to keep his movements quiet from probably a little bit both enemies and potentially maybe even Lincoln. He cuts his telegraph lines as he's going. So as they went, they destroyed railroad tracks, tunnels, bridges, you name it. They would do what they call them Sherman's neckties with railroad tracks, where they would cut the ties, burn them, and then wrap them around trees so that they're just completely unusable. So he sends out Special Field Order 120 that required every brigade to have a foraging detachment, and basically was to keep a 3-day supply of food. And these foragers, or some people call them bummers, they would just go out as Sherman's men were marching. They'd pitch tents, wake up, march all day, basically wouldn't eat lunch or anything, just kind of ate what they could find, and then they'd pitch tents and cook their dinner. While they're marching, the foragers are out roaming around, going to plantations and taking what they can take, trying to provide food and everything like that for the rest of the guys.
What Sherman's men can't eat, they destroy. Sherman cuts a 50-mile wide swath through central Georgia. The Confederacy is powerless to stop him.
So this would be this is most of where probably the controversy of Sherman comes from. Obviously the Southerners didn't like that. They would have looked at it as he's stealing all our stuff and he's burning our farms and fields and houses and destroying our roads and bridges. Mm-hmm. And Sherman looked at it as long as you guys keep fighting, we're going to continue this, and whenever you quit, we'll be done.
We have devoured the land, and our animals eat up the wheat and cornfields close. All the people retire before us, and desolation is behind. To realize what war is, one should follow our tracks.
It was psychological warfare to him.
It's the terror. Sherman's waging war against the minds of his opponents.
Sherman's march is not just a war on Southern resources. It's also a war on white Southern morale.
Which, to this point in time, really wasn't. He was kind of the first guy to bring that psychological, we're going to destroy the countryside, we're going to do whatever it takes sort of thing until you quit, but we'll show you how bad this can get. So as he's marching, one interesting thing that's happening is there's a population of ex-slaves who are following behind him. They kind of slowed him down because then there's more people you need to feed and everything like that, but they were going to follow. They'd rather follow them than be where they were, obviously, or be with the Confederate Army. You'd rather be with the Union Army, even though there's a lot of racism in the Union Army too, but to a lesser extent than the Confederate Army, where they would have returned them to be slaves or worse. So this leads to probably one of the most controversial events of the march, where the Union guys are crossing a pontoon bridge. They set up these floating bridges to cross rivers, and the last Union guy gets across, and they had told all these slaves, there's 650 ex-slaves back there. They said, just wait till we cross and then you can cross. Well, they didn't do that. They unlatched the pontoon bridge or whatever, let it float down the river.
One of Sherman's commanders orders a temporary bridge dismantled after the army crosses, but before any refugees can follow.
But the Confederates are closely on their tail, so the ex-slaves jump in the river and try to swim across, and a bunch of them ended up drowning, and he took a lot of flack for that in the northern papers. Sherman did. So
sights of elderly men hobbling across as best they could, women with babies in arms trying to cross. It was one of those, it was a terrible tragedy.
The guy's name who was kind of in charge of that, Sherman was obviously the high up, but the guy underneath him who was in charge of whatever happened, his name was Jefferson Davis too, which is kind of interesting, but obviously different than the other Jefferson Davis. But Yeah, so Sherman actually ended up defending Jeff Davis, saying that it was the ex-slaves' fault because he told them not to follow his army, and they did anyway. So
Sherman's main objective was always to restore the Union, not to free 4 million enslaved Americans. In the end, Sherman's march through Georgia accomplished both.
I think that's where that ambivalence comes from. There's some who recognize that Sherman was just, in fact, doing his job, and that part of that job meant that they would benefit in some way, but not that he was necessarily personally invested or interested in what that outcome would be for them.
Sherman, he said, there's no doubt many acts of pillage, robbery, and violence were committed by these parties of foragers, but I never heard of any cases of murder or rape. So, you know, he's kind of, because there'd be people, as they were walking through the countryside, rumors would spread like, oh, Sherman's here, Sherman's there. You know, there was a sense of fear and paranoia to an extent because you didn't want your farm to be raided. And so probably some exaggerations took place and everything like that. But so Sherman was saying like, well, I never heard of anyone raping or murdering anyone, but who knows? I mean, that's probably something that's not reported 100%, you know, so you kind of take all that with a grain of salt on both ways, because probably some of the atrocities are over talked about and some of them are maybe under talked about on the other side. I mean, he kind of liked these rumors and everything because it just played into his hands of, like I said, that psychological, like the more we can get in your head type of warfare. But on December 21st, they ended up taking Savannah and they reattached the supply line, and basically that ended their march.
In 37 weeks, Sherman's armies have marched more than 300 miles across Georgia. Atlanta, industrial hub of the Deep South, is in ruins. Bridges, cotton, livestock, factories, telegraph lines, and hundreds of miles of railroads are destroyed.
Then he ended up marching again through South Carolina, and even though it's less famous, he probably brought more destruction on South Carolina than he did Georgia. Sherman thought this was like probably the quickest way to end the war, and even though we're gonna do a lot, you know, it's not gonna be popular along the way. There's only 3,000 casualties on the march to the sea compared to what we talked about, Gettysburg.
Yeah, one battle.
Gettysburg had 51,000, I think, in 3 days. So, you know, he kind of thought, well, but it was different because they were destroying a bunch of property, which he would have looked at as better than killing a bunch of people, but some of the people whose property it was may not have viewed it that way. After the war, he writes, I confess without shame I am sick and tired of fighting. Its glory is all moonshine. Even success, the most brilliant, is over dead or mangled bodies, with the anguish and lamentations of distant families appealing to me for sons, husbands, and fathers. 'Tis only those who have never heard a shot, never heard the shriek and groans of the wounded and lacerated, that cry aloud for more blood, more vengeance, more desolation. War is hell. After the war, America is starting to expand westward. He basically took that same mentality that he had as far as like the total war of the landscape, everything like that, and applied it to the Indian Wars.